Chapter 5. The funeral was a long affair. Too long for a bunch of kids. Fortunately, after the first rounds of visitation, Sean and Serenity went to the church's babysit so they could be less constrained by the expectation of adults. Unfortunately, Sarah wasn't so lucky. The little girl's natural exuberance and gaiety didn't do well at a funeral. Several times Cynthia found herself wondering if she should confine the 6-year-old to the nursery as well. Simon and Serena were giving Sarah constant reminders to behave, even as they tried to keep on brave faces. Cynthia was trying to keep on a brave face for herself. Listening to the pastor discuss all the good qualities of Alicia and Guy made her miss them more. The irony of it was she only saw them once a year. Sure, Cynthia and Alicia phoned each other regularly, mainly because Alicia demanded it. If Alicia hadn't been so pushy to keep in contact with Cynthia, she probably would have let the relationship falter a lot more than it had. It made Cynthia feel guilty. She didn't like that feeling at all. She wondered what people might say at her funeral if she were to die today. She imagined her uncle would come. Derek would have to handle all the details. There was no one else. The thought scared her. Cynthia really was alone in this world. She had no close relationships. She had no friends. She worked and worked, keeping herself busy to climb to the top. Yet if she died, would her clients care? Would anyone from the firm come? No. If they even bothered to do anything, it would be send flowers. Cynthia glanced around the church. It was hard since they had been seated right at the front. The sanctuary was packed. People had shown up to show their respect to the Roms family, their love for Alicia and Guy. Maybe her sister had been on to something after all. Every time Alicia had commented that Cynthia wasn't living a full life, Cynthia had just scoffed at her. She'd said she was doing great, serving people through the law. Alicia had said that she personally served people through her faith, through her kindness, through her humility. Cynthia never really understood that. She still didn't. Yet she did understand that it had made a couple hundred people show up to honor Alicia and Guy. They were much loved. Probably, just as much as she loved them, these people did too. Alicia and Guy had belonged to an entire community of people. Sarah began to cry. Not just sniffling like Simon or Serenity were, but full-on crying. Cynthia sighed and held out a hand. "Why don't we visit Sean and Serenity?" The little girl gulped and nodded, latching on to Cynthia's outstretched palm. They walked down the aisle and headed for the nursery. "I tried to be good, I did." Sarah wiped her face with a hand. "What do you mean?" Cynthia paused in the hallway and rooted around in her purse for a small packet of tissues. She handed them to Sarah. "I know I don't sit still very well," Sarah complained as the tears dripped down her face. "Serena hissed at me." "She what?" Cynthia frowned. "She told me to stop being a baby and sit still." Sarah blew her nose, hiccuping. "I tried to sit still. It's just so hard." "Oh, Sarah." Cynthia knelt and gave the girl a little hug. "You were doing the best you could, right?" "Yes." She nodded against Cynthia's shoulder, hugging her back. "Then no one can ask any more than that." Cynthia rubbed her back. "You did just fine. Do you want to go back and sit with me instead? Or do you want to go with Sean and Serenity where you won't be expected to try to sit still?" "I want to sit with you," Sarah decided. She gave Cynthia her used tissue. Cynthia debated what to do with the gooey mess before shrugging and sticking it in her purse. She put a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and they re-entered the church, this time Sarah sitting away from Serena. Cynthia wrapped her arm around the little girl's shoulder, and Sarah snuggled into her as they listened to the pastor. Cynthia didn't have any problems with the normally boisterous youngster after that, since Sarah fell asleep, drooling on Cynthia's dress. Strangely enough, Cynthia found she didn't mind. After the sermon ended, Derek ended up carrying the sleepy girl to the car that they had hired for the day. Cynthia wondered if they should take Sean or Serenity to the graveside, but Derek vetoed that idea. "They're comfortable enough in the nursery," he said. "Plus, we don't need to give Sean nightmares." "Perhaps we should leave Sarah in the nursery," Cynthia frowned. "The other kids will wake her up. Let her sleep. If she's still snoozing by the time we hit the cemetery, I'll just carry her again." Derek shrugged, the little girl sleeping on him. "Thank you," Cynthia said quietly. He looked at her, a little startled. Cynthia hardly ever said those words, even to him. I mean it, she clarified. Thank you for everything you've done today, for helping to set all this up, for being here. I really appreciate it. Cynthia grabbed a tissue and blotted her eyes for a moment. She knew that she took him for granted. Today was especially trying, and he'd been there the entire time for her and the kids. Derek cleared his throat. You're welcome. She nodded. Simon reached out and took her hand. Thank you, Aunt Cynthia. She gave his hand a squeeze. For what? For looking after us, he said simply. For not putting us in foster care. Oh, Simon. Cynthia tried to hold back more tears, blinking rapidly. I know we'll have our good times and bad times, but I will never put any of you in foster care. She was so glad that she hadn't turned her back on this little family. It might not have been what she wanted. However, Cynthia was determined to try and make it work. She was glad that Elisha and Guy had given her the opportunity, rather than grant guardianship to someone else. Cynthia reached out her other hand to Serena, and was surprised when the girl actually let her take it. Serena didn't look at her, just used her own tissue to wipe her eyes as she stared out at the scenery. However, Cynthia thought it was progress since Serena didn't take her hand away from the small comfort that Cynthia offered. The graveside was very emotional. It was hard to comprehend that the 2 caskets were there to be lowered into the ground, held the remains of Elisha and Guy. Derek held the sleeping Sarah. He laid his free hand on Cynthia's back in sympathy, letting her lean on him while the pastor continued to talk. Cynthia wouldn't remember a single word of what he said. Finally, they returned to the church for the funeral luncheon. Cynthia could understand why people put the luncheons on. While she wasn't particularly hungry, everyone else seemed to be. They retrieved Sean and Serenity from the nursery, roused a sleepy Sarah, and sat down to partake of the ham and cheese buns offered. Cynthia sipped her coffee. It wasn't gourmet, but it was needed caffeine. Her nerves were nearly shot for the day. She eyed Sarah a little enviously. Cynthia could use a nap herself. Instead, she concentrated on making sure Sean ate his bun rather than leaving the majority of it on the floor. He was a very messy eater, she'd discovered. She didn't know how he managed to stay alive, since it seemed like all the food that was given to him to ingest invariably ended up in his hair, on his face, hands and clothes, or the furniture and the floor. His little church clothes were going to need dry cleaning. Did one dry clean children's clothing? Cynthia didn't know. She supposed she'd have to find out. They endured the constant stream of condolences that people gave as they dropped in to introduce themselves during the little meal. Cynthia wondered if her face was about to crack from so much smiling. Finally, Derek grabbed the boys to wash up. Mainly, Simon and Derek would just wash Sean up. Cynthia passed Sarah a wet wipe. She cleaned off Serenity herself, even though the baby had remained clean while eating her cereal and drinking her bottle. Dear, I forgot your name. A little old lady crept forward to shake Cynthia's hand. You're Alicia's sister. Cynthia Stone. Cynthia supplied as she took the gnarled fingers and gave the elderly woman a handshake. Cynthia dredged up another weary smile. My daughter works at the school the children go to, the woman supplied without introducing herself. Obviously, she thought that Cynthia should know who she was. Cynthia didn't have a clue and wasn't about to ask. She couldn't remember any names today anyways, so it was pointless. That's nice, Cynthia replied neutrally. Honey, you need to take a spoon of honey before you go to sleep at night. Just a teaspoon, the lady said sagely. That'll do the trick. My mother swore by it. Cynthia blinked. She was obviously very tired. Cynthia couldn't even follow the woman's conversation. Honey? That's right. Soothes the throat. She nodded wisely and winked. The old remedies are the best. And I need to soothe my throat because... Cynthia asked curiously. For the snoring. It's one thing if a man snores. Us women are expected to put up with it. However, if a woman snores, raise the roof. The marriage is on the rocks. The old woman chuckled, amused at her own little joke. When my Margaret said that you and your mister were living in separate houses because of your snoring, I just had to let you know there are better ways than what those doctors always say. Thank you, Cynthia said faintly. You're very welcome, dearie. She patted Cynthia on the shoulder. Then she made comments as to Serenity's cuteness and left. I don't think you snore. Sarah scrunched up her little face. How would you know? Serena asked her sister. You're asleep by the time Aunt Cynthia goes to bed. Cynthia thought back to Derek hustling her and Simon out of the school office. She had a suspicion she knew exactly what had been going on. Derek returned with the boys. All clean and past inspection. Cynthia cocked her head to the side. I'm sorry to hear that my snoring bothers you. Derek flushed a little. Perhaps he'd gone a little too far. Then again, well, darling, he put some emphasis on the word, reminding her that she'd labeled him as her significant other at the school office. It came as quite a surprise to me as well. I hadn't really thought about it until we clarified the terms of our relationship. Cynthia blinked. He'd been upset because she'd said they were in a relationship? She hadn't exactly lied, just overstated the exact circumstances so they wouldn't have as many issues with signing Derek on as the next person with permissions to pick up the kids. Maybe she should have asked his permission instead of just bullying him into doing what she wanted. Then again, Cynthia had always found that bending someone to her will was just more expedient. Touché. She raised an eyebrow. She'd let him win this round. However, next time one of the kids were sick, Cynthia was going to let him pick them up. He smiled. She smiled back, and Derek began to worry. He knew at some point Cynthia would return the favor. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, please look for the next chapter of Sweet Valentine. Also, please like this video. This is free for you and would really help me grow my audience with the algorithms. Thank you.